Hello, Namaskar, and thanks to those of you who've been with us through, of course, yesterday and today, and welcome to those of you joining us for this very special session at Himalayan Echoes 2024. It's such a beautiful, picturesque setting, and I'm sure we're going to have some riveting conversation. This is a very pertinent book. Here it is, Who is Equal? The Equality Code of the Constitution. It's often being debated about these days on television, where we are also talking about it, but of course it's also being talked about in courts, in parliament, and in various state assemblies as well, apart from, of course, the campaign trail, which is on in 2 states as we speak. But let me begin by actually asking Saurabh, because he's written, it is not his first book, he's written before, but what was the trigger for you, Saurabh, to write Who is He?
Well, I suppose it came from a place of deep inequality that I felt about my own life. I'm a gay man. I'm clothed otherwise with caste and class privilege. I come from a wealthy family. But none of those things which otherwise would clothe me and protect me was sufficient to stop the daily discrimination that I felt on the ground of my sexuality. And that's something interesting about equality as opposed to, say, a right to freedom. Everyone wants a free right to free speech. They all know it because they all speak, right? You know what that right means because everyone has it already. Equality is peculiar because its effects are only felt when you don't have it. So it's a woman who will truly understand what it means to be unequal as a woman because a man doesn't have that sense. Equally with the lower castes, it's a very divisive topic, caste. So I felt it was important for me to write not only my perspective on sexuality, but also try to unpick the questions of gender, caste, and multiple other things that I've written in my book. So it was kind of a book about myself, but also a book about the state of our country. Now more than ever, it's a discussion that needs to happen.
Yes. Before I get to some of the other aspects considered by the book, was one of the reasons you felt this inequality, the fact that despite multiple recommendations, your name was not finalized to be a judge and is still not finalized. Is that one of the main reasons?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a main reason, it is a reason. I am simply symptomatic of the homophobia that exists in the country. It's a homophobia that's diminishing. I grew up in India in the 80s and I saw what it meant to be a queer person then. It was not an easy time. And it's improved substantially. But yes, I don't think there's any denying of the fact that my appointment has been held up because of my sexuality. Why that should make a difference to anybody, I fail to understand. But obviously it does matter to people. And because it matters to them and it matters to me, I find that you have to resist even more. It's very easy to just throw your hands up and say, you know, I was reading in the newspapers that after Trump's election, one of the biggest searches is how to move to Canada or how to move to New Zealand. Well, you can just throw up your hands and give up and say, all right, I'll just move out of the country. I know many friends of mine who say that, who may be upset about certain things. I say no. You have to stand and fight, resist, bring the change, be the change. Understand that you also can't bring change by just fighting and being aggressive. You can bring change by being maybe seen as a reasonable person who's putting out things out there in the public domain which need to be said in a spirit of dialogue and conversation. So that's what somewhat of this book is. It's about conversation. It's not about pointing fingers alone, because that's not how change happens. It's about starting conversations.
But I have, I have to ask you though, is the idea of equality though, you know, something that is elusive to achieve? Is that something that we can only have in a utopian world? Is that idealism, or is it something that can practically happen?
Equality is extremely hard to achieve. If you need evidence of it, ask any woman who's sitting in the audience. We have been free now for 75 years. The lot of women of the scheduled castes, I mean, I wonder how many Dalits are in this audience. I'm sure almost none, if any. Why is that the case? Because you are not equal. You are not treated the same as everybody else. Why is that the case? Possibly human nature. Maybe Indian nature also, but I think generally it's human nature. We like to progress, and in that progress of our own ideas and what we want to be, we often drag down other people, and that causes some kind of a envy if you're at the bottom, and pride if you're at the top, and that perpetuates it. I am proud to be richer, more powerful, and therefore I will sustain that by pushing people down further to ensure I stay that way. So there is great merit in inequality for the people who are the beneficiaries of that inequality. The rich will want to have an economic system where the wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few. Men will obviously want patriarchy because it suits them. So to move away from this to a more equal society, you have to chip away at those who have all the power. And they're not easily going to give it away. So that's why it's tough to be an equal country.
How difficult was it? This is not a very fat book to actually talk about topics, delving into religion, caste, gender, sexual orientation, all of that in one concise book.
Well, there's a unifying theme in all of it, which is the idea of equality. So that's not difficult. We all know what it really means, what equality is. And we lawyers are not known for being very precise and concise. Sometimes we speak a bit more than we ought to, and our judgments are particularly bad that way, rather longer than they need to be. So I made a conscious effort to write a book that was something that people would be fearful of picking up, because very often when you see these legal tomes, you just say, I'm not even going to bother reading it. So the book had to be accessible. But ultimately, I believe if an idea as powerful as equality can't be put down simply in a 300-page book, then really there's a failure on my part. But also, I think it's also failure in imagination that we can't talk about it. Also, the book, which leaves you with questions, it doesn't aim to answer. I'm not going to think for you. I'm going to put out the questions there that you will then reflect upon. So there are a lot of unanswered questions in the book, which I think people, I hope, will reflect. A lot of readers, I think, just want spoon feeding. I don't aim to do that. I think it should allow you to free your mind, especially the young.
Yes, absolutely. Some of our discussions is where we try and leave people with questions to ponder over as well on our TV channel. But who should actually be the one responsible for bringing about equality in our country?
And buy things, and there's nothing you can do about it. So full-fledged anti-discrimination law does not exist after 75 years. So the courts have no option when they see that to step in and say, well, this is just not right. This is not part of our constitutional ethos and our values. And they will then step in. When they step in, it seems like overreach. But this is a problem that Parliament has had 75 years to solve and haven't done it. So what do? We wait for another 75 years? I practice and preach patience as well. But patience is another form of perpetuation of disadvantage. The young should not have to suffer any more than we did.
Let's talk about then reservation. Now, reservation was something that was brought about to help end inequality, to help bring about equality. You were questioning over here how many Dalits are in the room. That's something that Mr. Rahul Gandhi also is doing at his rallies. But do you believe, before we get to, of course, the question of the constitution that the opposition has been raking up, but do you believe reservation has helped? Has reservation, been implemented in the correct manner? Is reservation still needed if it hasn't helped all these years? Should we increase reservation if it hasn't helped? So, what's your take on reservation and how it's, been used?
I'm a great votary of reservations. It is necessary, but not sufficient, and I think that is where lies the problem. It is necessary because you can't expect two extremely unequal people to compete for the same thing, right? If you are a Dalit woman or a Muslim woman from a village, as opposed to, say, a son of a rich industrial magnate in a city, you can't say, all right, you compete for the same job or the same institution or the same medical school seat. You can't. People are not equal. So reservations are nothing but evening the starting block of people who are otherwise completely unequal historically. And unequal not only maybe, sometimes they say, oh, there's your father, an IFS officer, you may be Dalit, but why do you need reservations? Because reservations are needed because discrimination has almost entered our DNA. you can't remove a perception of a person as thinking lower of themselves by making one generation richer, when it has been centuries of oppression which have made people think of themselves in a particular way. So therefore reservations are, I think, imperative because they are an equalizing force. As I said, people don't like reservations. Why? Because the people who are benefiting from absence of reservations are the ones who have the power. They are typically the ones saying, no, no, what about merit? Why should I have to then not get that seat because what about merit? Merit is again that precise thing. How did you get that merit? By going to that elite school, by speaking the English language, and speaking English not only because you were taught it in school, but your family speak it, and there's a perpetuation of that. And English is, let's face it, is the lingua franca of our country. Therefore, I believe reservations are essential. The problem with reservations is that, of course, they're repolarizing because resources are very few. A simpler thing in our country would be, let's build more colleges which are world class. Let's offer more jobs out in the private sector so that people don't need to fight for public sector jobs. But we're not doing those tough things. We're only talking about reservations as a simple solution because that's captured the public imagination and it makes the hard work easy to avoid. You just throw reservations at everybody and say, well, that's going to solve everything. No, that's not going to solve the problems of our country. It's not going to solve the problems of inequality.
Okay. Then delimitation. Again, delimitation happens and it is going to happen now. I think before 2028 is what we're hearing. That means 2029 general elections could possibly see new constituencies created, maybe more constituencies created. Also, the ones reserved for SCs, STs changed as well. Has delimitation helped? Has this concept of reservation of constituencies also helped in greater representation in the executive, be it in parliament or be it in legislative assemblies across the country?
Well,
and what would be your advice, given the fact that there's a new delimitation exercise on the anvil?
Well, how about starting with the one-third reservation for women that you promised? That's not happening. People are not interested. Let's be clear about that. These are just words they bandy about. Reservations in parliamentary constituencies and legislative assemblies are interesting because unlike public employment and education, where reservations are provided for as attempt to remedy historical injustices alone, reservations in constituencies are meant to power you politically. Because you can bring about a change in your life, not just by courts giving you reservations, but by electing people who are your voice. Which is why there is a concept of proportional representation. And the idea originally in the Constitution was that you will have a reservation for 10 years or 15 years, only for constituency, not for public employment. That was meant to be forever. But of course, that's been extended further and further away because you have found that even though you have reservations in constituencies, it has not actually resulted in that equality. You have had presidents who have been Dalit, not yet have had a Dalit prime minister. So where is that political power that we're talking now? I don't think it exists.
President. Yes. I know we have about 5 minutes and then we'll open it up for questions. Let's just talk about also now the caste factor. And there is again a census as well that probably will be beginning next year. Now, the Prime Minister speaks about 4 different castes, that is women, youth, farmers and poor. He says those are the only castes that should matter to anyone. You have opposition leaders like Rahul Gandhi and Akhilesh Yadav and others who hold up a copy of the constitution in the election rallies as we saw in Lok Sabha polls and say caste-based survey is needed, caste-based census is needed because we are not representing the marginalized communities enough in jobs and in public life, etc. What's your take on that? Is a caste-based census needed or not? If we talk more about caste, are we bridging society? Are we dividing society further on the basis of caste lines, or actually are we empowering, those from marginalized castes?
No, there's a bit of truth in everything that you said. That when you do focus on caste, you focus on a particular identity, you will exclude certain other identities and therefore create some kind of divisions. But those divisions exist in our society already. And to therefore paper over them and pretend they don't exist is also a mistake. You need a caste-based survey because you will get information about the makeup of our country. It's something that we haven't done since the 20s. We don't know. It's all about projections about what the castes are, because there's been no proper caste survey on a scientific basis. It is information, and why are you scared of information? No one should be. But there's also lazy politics, I think, when you say, I will do politics just on the back of caste. Uh, it's a way to achieve political power than actually a desire to improve people's lives also. So I think there is a bit of truth in that. So I believe personally a caste-based census is essential. What you do with it is actually very important as well. Are you going to then restrain that and remove that information only for the purpose of creating more reservations?
Yes.
Or understanding the socio-economic movement of different castes and try to analyze that why is it that certain subcastes have within the in a caste moved up further?
Yeah.
Instead, when you have a judgment of the Supreme Court which says you must have subcastes within Dalit community and have different reservations, you have an uproar in political classes. People who say that we must have caste-based surveys are the first parties would say, why subdivide the Dalit community? Well, if you have subdivision of castes, you also have the reality of subdivision of Dalits within the country. So why is one thing okay, not the other thing okay? I don't think there's a good faith argument in political parties on issues of caste ever.
Okay. A final question to you before we open it up for some audience questions is on the issue of same-sex marriages as well. Now, you spoke, of course, about sexual orientation earlier, and we've seen finally a Supreme Court verdict also on the decriminalization of homosexuality, but no same-sex marriages yet legalized in India. Now, do you see that happening anytime in the near future? How have countries abroad done it? What's the model from there that we can adopt here? Or is that something you believe is not something that's going to be practically achievable in the near future in India?
Well, I had hoped that the Supreme Court would fulfill its constitutional obligation, responsibility and promise and give marriage equality the way it did in the US. That's how it happened in the US. It didn't do so. I think they showed a lack of courage and a lack of vision. It's not easy for lawyers to call out the Supreme Court and judges, but I think one has to. One should not be shy of saying when someone has done something wrong. And judges should not be afraid of criticism. So they didn't actually deliver on that promise. So now we have the political realm to fall back on. That's slightly tougher because a government that wasn't even willing to bring in legislation to decriminalize homosexuality, which was for it okay to send people to prison for life if they had sexual intercourse with their partner, is not going to exactly bring about legislation to have marriage equality. But I believe small changes are happening. We're a young country, and while homophobia and discrimination is ingrained deeply in a person of a certain age and class, young don't think like that, I don't think, anymore. And as the country becomes more youthful, and as younger people come to power, and as political parties have to cater to what young people want, I think change will happen. It'll be a creeping kind of change. It won't be one big fell swoop, tomorrow marriage equality comes in. But you will get a series of rights and recognitions, which I think will eventually form a body or a pool of rights, which will then move on maybe to recognition of a marital union or a union akin to a marital union, a civil union as they call it, which eventually may move into marriage. We're a very deeply religious country, and nothing wrong with that, and that's who we are. So the idea that marriage is a religious institution and marriage equality will undermine it, that also needs to be addressed by saying no, while marriage is a religious institution, it is also a secular institution. Under the Special Marriage Act, a Muslim man and a Hindu woman can get married if they're not beaten up in the 30-day notice period that you had in the love jihad laws. But it is a union between two people, which is a bouquet of rights, and people are entitled to those rights. So I think that discourse and education needs to happen. I think often people who are activists and those in the queer community just expect that people will have the most liberal attitudes, and if you're not agreeing with me, then you're a bad person. As opposed to, and they therefore abdicate their own responsibility of teaching. You have to educate people, and you have to inform them that this is why I want what I want, and this is why it's morally justified, and this is why you ought to be an ally. So that responsibility is first on us to not judge people and condemn them for their illiberal views, but to engage with them and say, this is why you should do this, this is the right thing to do for this reason. So I hope once we as a community get our voice heard and we learn that lesson ourselves, and I'm commenting about, we must talk about judges and criticize them, let's criticize myself. I don't think I have done enough in educating people and engaging. So once we do that, world will change.
All right. Well, fascinating discussion as I promised you at the start of the show, and I said at the start of the session, beg your pardon, and I had said, of course, that this book is so varied, so many issues that we've spoken about in this one session have all been covered in the book. So if you want more insights, well, you've got to read the book by Saurabh. It's available here, and he's available to sign them as well. I think maybe one question. Yeah. Okay. Who would like to ask a question, please? Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. What a lovely session. I can't believe, Saurabh, how eloquent you are. It's just, it's overwhelming actually. And
I thought I was prettier than smarter, but
you surprised me. You're as smart as you are pretty. So I'm just curious to know, we didn't really talk about the creative process. So I'm just wondering, that's something, a topic that is so close to your heart, that when you wrote this, did this sort of bring a sense of equanimity within you, a calm, or did it make you feel like, holy shit, I have to do more?
both.
Or something else?
It was actually both. As a lawyer, your training requires a certain amount of detachment. When you go into court and you argue a case, you can't identify with your client too much because you then can't do justice to the case. Because sometimes you have to back off, sometimes you have to fight. It's important to have that distance from your client. So therefore, I think it was easy for me to write that part. When I was writing about marriage equality, that's when I got angry. I think my anger came across in my discussion I had just now as well, because it's deeply personal. And while I may be a lawyer who has had decades of training of dissociation and disengagement and distance, I'm also a human being, and I also feel. And when I feel let down by an institution that claims to be morally superior, the courts enforce their verdicts not by armies rushing in and enforcing their verdicts, but in the people of the country believing that what the court has said is morally justified. Once that moral authority does something which is amoral, or I believe even immoral, that makes me angry. So then I lost that equanimity. I tried to be reasonable and rational when I write, but it seeps through somewhere.
And how do you cope with that?
I open a nice bottle of red wine in the evening and have a
As we saw on the day. Lovely.
Which is how he's going to cope with today's questions in our session as well. All right, thank you very much once again, Saurabh Kirpal, for a great session, and thank you to the audience for being very patient and energetic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the insights. Let's leave here with